Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for the Engaging with Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity workshop. We're just going to go ahead and begin right now. If you could kindly please sign in, David will be providing the sign-in link. We'll also be sharing a QR code for those who need, who aren't able to sign in with the link. So you could just scan the QR code with your personal device, so it'll be easier access. I'm also gonna have Carmen come out a speaker, and she's just gonna.
Because I've never parked outside.
Carmen, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, there you go.
Buenos días a todos y bienvenidos a la reunión. Si desean escuchar esta interpretación en español y están en su computadora o una laptop, abajito en su tablero, en el inferior de su tablero van a mirar un símbolo de un mundo. En ese mundo icono van a poder hacer clic y elegir el idioma de su preferencia, que sería el español. Si están en su teléfono celular o una tableta, abajito en su tablero van a mirar 3 puntitos que dicen more o más, y ahí van a poder elegir el idioma de su preferencia, que será el español. Gracias.
We're gonna move on. And again, here's the QR code. If you are unable to use the sign-in link, you can just scan the QR code, send you straight to the sign-in link. I'll leave this up for a couple of seconds. We also will be showing this at the end of the meeting as well. So for anyone who misses it, don't worry. And then today's topic will be Diversity and Inclusion 101. Again, good morning and thank you guys for joining us. And then we have our facilitator, the wonderful Danielle Johnson. So I'll pass it on to you, Danielle.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. If at any time you cannot hear me or if I sound like I'm in a fishbowl, please let me know. And if you cannot see something, please let me know. I will go ahead and get started, get my computer all together. So thank you for joining today. We are looking at Diversity and Inclusion 101. This will be a lot more robust than our past conversations. So there'll be a couple of, probably 2 breakouts, a little bit more information heavy. I know we have about an hour and 15 minutes. So I want to make sure that we dive right in. As it was shared from Stephanie, my name is Danielle Johnson, and I have the pleasure of being your conversation catalyst today. If you all were here last time, or if you've ever come to any of these, feel free to take whatever you need to be able to share in your organizations and your circles as you're continuing to do this work. It's important to understand that while attending trainings are great, that's half the battle, right? Being in attendance to learn the information. It's what you utilize and what you move forward within your circles, your organizations, that's actually going to have the DEI work move forward. So please feel free to use what you see. A catalyst is an event or person that causes great change. And so while we are having the conversations today, we want to make sure that we're catalyzing the work that we're doing. What does that impact actually look like when we are carrying out DEI in our places and spaces? Just very quickly, because we don't have as many breakouts today, I would love for you all to just kind of share in the chat, if you will, where you're coming from. So just like to see who's all on the screen. I know obviously virtual gives us opportunity to see people from around the world. We've had a lot of people come in from a number of spaces. So just a quick, your name and where you're coming from. And if folks just want to kind of notate who they're seeing and where they're seeing folks in the chat, where you all coming from. So today, Diversity and Inclusion 101, and that can mean a lot of different things. For inclusive growth strategies, what we're going to focus on in our one-on-one is common language, so you're going to get some definitions. Why making D&I a priority is important. What some of those organizational impacts have been, some of those missteps in DEI, intro into social identities, intro into microaggressions, intro into privilege and oppression, and then we'll end with some action steps and close with Q&A. There are going to be, I say intro because within this series, we'll actually have longer segments with social identities, microaggressions, and privilege and oppression, but kind of want to tap into that today in our 101. I see some of the pieces coming in. Obviously, lots of folks from California today. Thank you all for being here. And co-creating the space in diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging, if you're using that language, is really important to make sure that you're creating a space where folks feel like they can engage, where they can be seen and heard. Sometimes, though, oftentimes, people are still not comfortable with DEI topics. And so there will be time and space where you're leaning into a particular topic that people just don't see themselves in. But helping to co-create that space will bring folks into the conversation or feel like they are still a part of that conversation. So as we co-create, we want to make sure that we're engaging in an intentional relationship in order to make something together, right? We're making DEI together in this space. This is a learning space. So please feel free to share, ask your questions. Because of time, if I have to move us along, I'm not trying to intentionally shut you down, but I just want to make sure that we're staying on task. And I'll try to be as mindful as I can to kind of watch the chat as well for questions. I know that there are some other experts on the screen. If there are some responses that you have to things that are said, please drop them in the chat and connect in this space with others as well, right? Because there's synergy in working alongside those that are doing DEI work across your communities. And then let's create a space where we engage and grow in this learning environment. Some conversational expectations to go through. Some of you are probably very familiar with these or utilize them in your organizations. As a facilitator, I do reserve the right to halt the discussion and maintain order. I have not had to do that. Lots of tension in spaces when we've had these discussions, but folks, for the most part, have been able to stay in the dialogue and agree to disagree, but ensuring that they're still present, being present and respectful in this space. I say that to say, if you have a million things going on your screen, now would be the time to start minimizing and trying to be as engaged as you possibly can. The beauty of being hybrid is you can be in a space and be still working, or be in a space, be on a meeting and still be doing a million other things. Don't cheat yourself this morning. Please try to be as engaged as you possibly can. And then I would also invite those of you that can, if you're in a place and space to do so, to join me on screen. Please be muted if you're not talking, but join me and join your fellow attendees on the screen if you can. That just helps us feel a little bit more connected in our virtual Zoom world. Lean in. There's oftentimes discomfort in these topics in the work that we're doing. Please lean into that discomfort for growth. There might be something that is said that goes against your belief system, your values, your culture. How can you engage in that a little bit more and share your side while also being open to the dialogue today? Why am I talking? Why am I not talking? Or wait, I love this. Some folks are a little bit more introverted, so you might need a little bit more time before you jump on in. I ask that if that's you, maybe push on yourself a little bit to be engaged in this space as you can. Please feel free to use the chat function, ask your question, say your statement where you can. And then those of us that are a little bit more chatty, we're used to jumping in. I ask that you just wait a moment, because sometimes when we jump in, we are taking the opportunity for other folks that have been trying to get to, like hopscotch, or if you've ever done double dutch, they're trying to get in the conversation, but we're still talking, right? And I'm guilty of that sometimes, but I want to be able to hear from as many folks as we can and engage as much as we can. One mic, one person speak at a time. Land the plane, park the car, whatever your favorite kind of euphemism is, but ask your question. We don't want to be afraid to ask and engage in this space, but also we are using it as an educational space, right? None of us know everything about everything, right? We're a global society, and there are so many cultures, and there are so many values, and there's so many ways to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion. So please feel free, ask your question, say your statement, and let's give grace when we're in this space, right? We want to assume good intent, and ask the question, you said this, tell me more about what you meant by that, or where is that thought coming from, or where do you get that value from? So we want to assume good intent, but also remembering that freedom of speech is not freedom from consequence. You still may step in it, you still may be offensive, you still can be hurtful. An apology goes a long way, but not only the apology, the change in behavior and action. What is your habit? Right? If you continue to say the wrong pronoun, if you continue to say or misgender people, if you continue to say, well, I just have to be nice, but I don't actually have to do the research or the learning. We have to be able to understand the consequences of the things we say and do, but what are we going to do in our actions to really be redemptive when it comes to this space? And then stories stay and lessons leave. I don't know how many folks actually know each other on the screen. You may learn some things about each other in the small group. We ask that you continue to be respectful of each other's stories, but what are the principles and the lessons learned? that you can impart on others, right? Our stories are ours to tell. It is not our job to tell other stories from the space. And then lastly, as we're co-creating this space, I think it's important for us to lean into mindfulness. I know there's a few of you, some familiar faces that are very much mindfulness gurus in this space. It is important for us to understand that mindfulness is not some new trendy thing that popped up in the last year or so. It actually exists in some of our oldest people. We can go back to our ancestral line to see where mindfulness, storytelling, being present has been very important to a lot of our communities. So the more we can be engaged, the more we can be here. Whatever's comfortable for you. If you need to do a little stretch, you need to take some deep breaths, get the appropriate drinks or snacks, roll your neck, whatever it is that you need to do to be here for this hour and 15 minutes, please be mindful. The more mindful we tend to be, the more open we are to diversity, equity, inclusion, multicultural concepts. And then I think it's important to just kind of think about the quote from Maya Angelou: in diversity, there is beauty and there is strength, right? I like to think that diversity is a fact. This page is diverse, right? We may be missing some facets of diversity, but diversity just always is. What's not always present is inclusion, belonging, equity, equality. Those aren't facts. Those are things that we actively have to work through. But diversity, by just the very nature of the definition, is just present. So we're going to give you all an opportunity to loosen up a little and engage with one another in your small groups. This will be about a 6-minute or about actually 8 minutes. Sorry, about 8 minutes. I know sometimes these chats are small and folks really want to dive in with one another. So let's be mindful, think about our conversational expectations. But the questions for you to focus on are: what apprehensions, if any, do you have in engaging in diversity and equity and inclusion topics, right? For example, that might be saying something that might offend, not feeling like you're allowed to be a part of the discussion. Maybe you don't see yourself as a diverse individual, so you don't feel like the conversation is even for you. How do you see diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives benefiting you? So how it shows up in your personal life, and then maybe the organizations that you represent. How do you see these initiatives benefiting there? If you have some going on, share those, right? Again, we have a brief time. But if you feel like, it's not even a priority there, and I'm the one trying to spearhead that, share that too, so folks can hear from each other and engage. And then we'll kind of have a couple of folks share out. Not everyone, but please be prepared to share just a little. So again, 8 minutes to share, and you will go into your breakout rooms here soon. All right.
Everyone can do that, yeah.
Welcome back. I see all your faces popping back up on the screen. Again, I know you had about 8 minutes, so hopefully you had some fruitful conversation. If I can hear from maybe 1 or 2 folks on just what was shared. What are those apprehensions, if any? And then what are the benefits to yourself and the organization? One or 2 folks, and don't be shy, just hop on in. I know you all had conversation. Well, I
I'll
hope you
share.
had
I was trying to,
conversation.
I'm Danielle, I'm very loquacious, so I was trying to not to share.
I appreciate that. Go ahead.
But I will share, and then maybe my co-captains will like to. But we are in general saying that one of our fears and inhibitions we had with DEI was that, you're afraid to, some of us to misrepresent our own culture and what we share, but also in asking certain questions about other cultures, and that fear sometimes will halt you, and just trying to work through that fear of how do we get to know each other as human beings? But the only way to do that is to ask the questions and knowing what our intentions are. And then the DEI question, we just said in general that we appreciate what was brought up by my colleagues, was that we appreciate that our organizations are leaning into this more because we feel more seen and heard, and we're more visible. And the way that we're doing it inside our own organization is showing up how we work with our community and the constituents and clientele that we work with. But yeah, that's in summary. I'm trying to keep it short, but I think my other team members could share a little bit more if they decide.
Thank you for that. Yeah, right. Misrepresenting yourself, your own culture, trying to be curious but not disrespectful. Right? Yeah. Okay. Is there one other person in the crowd that might want to share something different? Okay, going once, going twice. I'm going to keep this train rolling. Okay, my hope is that you all were able to truly engage though in your small groups, and please feel free if you want to continue these conversations. You have folks that clearly care about this particular topic, so don't hesitate to inbox people on in this chat to continue these conversations and bring people together. So as we move forward, we want to just kind of start with some common language. A lot of us have different definitions for the words that we use. A lot of us have maybe a different nomenclature, if you will. So in this space, I want to just kind of center us in this particular language. As we move forward, when I say belonging or diversity inclusion isms, this is what I am referring to. There are no shortage of acronyms that we're seeing bounce around, and you may be utilizing these acronyms just as an important best practice. Whatever you're using for your councils, your initiatives, on your mission, vision, and value statements, make sure that you're doing that work, right? Don't just arbitrarily say, oh, they're using DEI. If you don't do equity work, don't put the E on your page, right? It needs to be reflective of what you're doing. So some things to consider: IND, inclusion and diversity, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're seeing the B, belonging, being added to a lot of these initiatives. Some folks are dropping equity because they are uncomfortable with the term. A lot of folks are adopting belonging because that seems to be a more comfortable term. Whatever your reasoning, be aware of why you're using the language. Sometimes you need that carrot to bring people into the discussion. So if you have to shift that language, that's understandable, but make sure that we're not scapegoating the language, right? Some people just don't see themselves in DEI and they think, oh, inclusion and belonging, let's go straight to that. You can't go straight to that if you are not aware of those that are represented in your organization, or you can, because we're seeing folks do it, but just be very mindful. DIB, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, whatever those kind of makeups are for you. What does belonging mean? Refers to human emotional need to feel secure and supported, that sense of acceptance, opportunity to affiliate with members of a group. Sometimes people say, well, what's the difference between belonging and inclusion? Aren't they the same? Right? You can be included in the conversation, but do you feel like you belong in that discussion? It's kind of one of my better examples, right? You can be at the table. They might have invited you here, pull a chair up. We would love to have you here, but don't say anything because I included you. That does not mean that you belong here. So just being mindful of that interchange. Diversity, the unique range of human differences. I like to use the term diversity facets. I shared earlier that diversity always exists. It's a fact. But what might not exist are the facets, right? There might be a women-heavy industry. You might have a predominantly Asian organization. There could be some things that are missing. Maybe you're a veteran serving organization, so you don't have a lot of civilians in the space. There could be facets missing in your conversation or in your organization. What are those facets? Inclusion, the involvement in an empowerment where the inherent worth and dignity of all people are recognized and valued. And then isms, we have no shortage of isms that exist out there, right? Racism, classism, ageism. What's important for us to understand is that these varying discriminations can interrupt our organizations, our households, our workplaces. They exist. And understanding what each of them mean. And because we are intersectional people, and I'll get into intersection here in a minute, there can be a number of things at play, right? You could be experiencing racism, sexism, and classism, right? There are sometimes that it's not just race-based discrimination, but there can be some intersects into what that discrimination is that you're experiencing. Privilege. Privilege exists when a group of individuals have something because they belong to that group, or that individual might have a little bit of a leg up because of their network, who they know, the family they were born into, the zip code they were born into. There's a lot of work being done around where you're born and what your opportunities are from those spaces, right? If you were at the first session, we talked about redlining, right? Access to the dollars in your school district, right? Where do your tax dollars go? We talk about the suburbs. Well, what are the opportunities there versus in your urban downtown areas? right? Very different. Understanding systemic, there are systems always at play. You're in a system in your organization, right? There's the federal system, there's your national system. What are those systems and cultures? And, culture is systemic. In systems theory, systems are interrelated, interconnected parts that create a whole. There are patterns of behavior, deeply rooted structural systems, which are beneath the waterline, right? There are a lot of systems that we're born into and that we kind of get categorized into. So what are those systems? And oftentimes to create big change, to catalyze change in DEI, you got to examine the system that you're in and what's happening in that system. Structural inequity. Structural inequity occurs when bias, not just racism, right? We all have bias. Sometimes folks say we got to get rid of bias. It's a brain function. We'll talk about implicit bias at another session, but what we know is you can mitigate bias, and you should mitigate bias, but you can't totally get rid of it because it's the way we make decisions. It's the way we discern things, but it can hinder people and opportunities when we let those biases stop opportunity. It's rooted into the structure of society, legal, educational, professional, and others, and gives certain groups advantage and marginalizes or discriminates against other groups. So again, structural inequity. Intersectionality, I said that earlier, that term is coined by the amazing scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. If you are looking to learn more about that particular topic, please look up Miss Kimberly. She is incredible in a number of ways, has an amazing TED Talk that really showcases a great example of intersectionality, but it's an understanding that describes the ways that systems of inequality based on social identities or facets, like I like to call them, gender, race, what have you, overlapped or intersect to create unique dynamics that affect one another. So just thinking about the intersections of everyone, right? You may have a more salient identity. I identify as a woman of color, a biracial woman, a Black woman. I'm half Black and half Filipino. I don't navigate the world as an Asian woman. The world doesn't necessarily see me as that. I have intersection there, but if I'm experiencing a level of discrimination, generally it's going to be my age, my race, my gender. There's an intersection to that. But just because I identify as biracial doesn't mean I experience the world from that same lens. I usually get people say, like, well, what are you? Depending on my hair and how tan I am that summer, right? There's a lot of things that go into my particular identity, but how folks interact with that can be very interesting. And some of those things are very much out of our control. Equality and equity, this is something that oftentimes gets interchanged. They are not the same words. And you also have to understand how you can lean into both. Because sometimes your organization is set up for you to just do equality work because there are some systems at play that won't let you lean into equity. And what that looks like here, the same quality or measure or esteem or value. So providing the same exact resource at the same time. We all get the donut. Whether we like the donut or not, we all get the glazed donut, and that's your snack. Equality, right? Equity refers to fairness and justice, and it's distinguished from equality. You're meeting someone where they are, basically, right? You are making sure that you are where they are in this space. So overcoming intentional and unintentional barriers in a system. I think we've all seen the arbitrary photo of equality and equity. This is the one I like. There are a number of them floating around, but it just, for those of you that are more visual, I'm a visual learner. On the first one, you can kind of see equality being played out, right? Everyone got that brown box to see over the fence, to see the game. We didn't necessarily take into account the needs of everyone. And I'm not saying equality is bad. I don't want you to walk away, because oftentimes people go back to, well, Dr. King said, understanding he talked from equality. Well, I would argue that Dr. King talked from both and really leaned into equity. So I think we kind of pull some statements from his incredible speeches, not really understanding what we mean by helping people and getting them where they need to be. So we're practicing equality here. In the second screen, we're seeing equity. We're seeing 3 people. The first person does not need an additional box. He can see over the fence perfectly. It would make no sense to give him any extra. The second person, who was kind of tiptoed in the first picture, needs 2 boxes to see over the screen. They need just a little bit more to be able to see at the same rate as the first person. The third person needs a wheelchair ramp. That box wasn't going to help him at all, right? So this is adapting. This is universal design. How are we ensuring? And to that, everyone technically could also walk up that ramp. So when we think about accessibility and we do accessibility for one, it actually ends up meaning for all. If someone needed to see over as well, we could go all ramps, no boxes. Liberation or justice would mean get rid of the fence. I can access this game at any level, regardless of who I am, where I am, how I identify. I can see the game from my vantage point. Maybe that's a see-through fence if you still needed to block for safety, right? I'm getting kind of technical here, but what would those things be to ensure that everyone can engage at the same rate, at the same time, at their level? I work for Habitat. I share this. For us, we work with people that are 30 to 80% of the area median income, right? So we're practicing equity in that way, but we're not necessarily practicing equality because there are folks outside of that space that need housing as well, but that's not the lane we're in. And so, and then there's fair housing laws that dictate who we work with and how we work with too, right? So again, toggling between what equity and equality looks like. So just thinking about for yourself and reflecting on those definitions that were shared. What's the work you're engaged in? And how can you move the needle in any one of these things? And is that your job to do so, or whose job? Who is accountable for making some of these moves happen in your organization? So as we move forward, I want us to also think about dimensions of diversity, right? Because we talked about those facets, but diversity looks different for each and every one of us. Consider yourself in the middle of this circle. Maybe it's your personality or identity, the you, who you are. And when you're looking into that internal piece, right, oftentimes we think of your kind of run-of-the-mill things that we think of when we think about diversity: race, age, sexual orientation, gender. Those are kind of the big four that come up most often in conversation. But also remembering national origin, physical and mental ability. Neurodiversity is becoming more a part of the DEI discussion. Veteran status is a part of the discussion. So how are we looking at those pieces? The external that run into DEI. So your education, your citizenship, family status, geographic location. What DEI looks like in Wichita, Kansas probably looks vastly different than in Lancaster, than in the Antelope Valley, right? There are similar struggles, but oftentimes there are certain things that even organization to organization, what's happening in those spaces that need a little bit more attention and what's crossing into that. At the organizational level, so just thinking about where you are you a union affiliated organization? Is there seniority or tenure being used? The department or division, management status or title, and then the era. There have been some pretty crazy things happening at the national level. I don't know how else to say that, a better way to say that, but right, we're coming through COVID. We're still in COVID technically, but it just looks different. So historical events, what are the historical events that you lived through that have shaped your lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion? World events, political events, cultural events, all these things shape how you interact, the words you use, the language, right? At one point in time, it was okay to say colored. It's not okay to say colored today, but in some parts of the country, that language is still very much used. In some households, that language is still very much used, but that has to do with historical time frame, what was okay at that time, what we embrace is okay, even if it wasn't. Those things show up in what we're doing. So these are the many things that we have to account for when we go into DEI. It's incredibly complex. It's not a one and done thing. So I want to stop there for a moment. So I just ran through a lot of kind of 101 information, common language. Any thoughts or questions at this point, please feel free to use the chat. I just want to check the temperature of where we're at with what's been shared so far.
Danielle, I was just going to say the concentric circle. I was thinking some of those intersectionality of your diversity could, in some cases, privilege you in one way, but also that same intersection can be a disadvantage depending on space and time and how you're moving. So I think about, I'm a 50-year-old Black woman. If I'm with my sorority sisters as part of predominant African-American sorority with all this rich history, when I'm in that circle, that wisdom and that being a little bit older like benefits me. Where if I move into a different space, it may be seen that same identity is works against me. So it's just interesting how any of these as you move can be a benefit to you
Mhm.
or also, work against you. Depending on who, how others are perceiving you or receiving you.
Right, right. No, absolutely right. That intersection and then privilege and oppression. How does that play? You could be loved and supported, and the person in this space and in another space, there is no belonging, there is no inclusion, and you're the only one in the room. So just how that shows up. Absolutely. Thank you for that. So we're gonna continue on making D&I a priority. And I know many of us have heard kind of, oh, it's the feel good, it's the common good, it's the right thing to do. And I certainly believe in that. I also understand the informed business practice. I like to think about Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola understands diversity to a pretty good degree, right? You can get a Coke here in the Philippines, in Spain, and they're going to market to you, to your community. They're going to make sure they get that Coke in your hand the way you need it, how you want it, whatever that is, right? So thinking about now internally, I'm not saying that Coke doesn't have problems. I'm not saying they totally have it together, right? But they're an organization that's going to have some of those business resource groups or employee resource groups. They understand to a degree what it takes to harness the person to sell that product and to ensure that they're creating these attachments with a Coca-Cola, right? And that is kind of what the essence of DEI is. It was both the common good and the business case. When we think about being able to bring your authentic self to work and what that looks like, having the understanding of experiences of diverse employees and customers. And I would challenge those of you, there might be folks on the screen that are like, I'm not a diverse individual. We sometimes have to extract minority and diverse person, right? We all bring a level of diversity in this space, whether you are a global majority person. That's a language I like to use, but I want to start with the term minority. I'm not going to say global majority. Oftentimes we'll say, well, I'm not a marginalized person, so DEI doesn't matter to you. Well, it does, right? It affects all of us. And we have to see ourselves as diverse human beings to be able to feel like we can be a part of the discussion. An inclusive environment minimizes that insider versus outsider culture, right? When you're thinking about being in your organization, how you show up, are you respected or do you have to duck and dodge? Do you have to code switch and hide and cover? Can you be in that space and be productive? In a Harvard Business Review study, it found employees in firms with diverse leadership are 45% likelier to report a growth in market share over the previous year and 70% more likely to report that the firm captured a new market. So when we think about what our markets look like, we are 5 generations in. When we think about traditionalists to Generation Z, and then we have that up and coming generation, there's a lot of folks in the workforce that come from different eras. And I'm thinking about growing up in community. When I started working, mental health days were not a thing. You came to work, right? There's that. But now we're seeing a shift and change in cultures and age groups, and that Generation Z and partially later millennials are talking about, man, I need to use my mental health days. I can't come in today. I need to have a mental health day, right? That language has even changed. An organization saying, ooh, we need some more counseling programs, those EAP programs. We want you to blend your personal and your professional. When many of us grew up in a time where personal is personal, don't bring that in the job. So we think about how those things are showing up and how we have to be flexible in this environment. And then lastly, employment recruitment and retention rates are higher as employees are able to bring their authentic self to work. Many of us are experiencing that labor shortage. I was at a talk recently where someone said, it's not that we have a labor shortage, we have an imagination shortage, right? There are a lot of people in the US right now that need to be employed. Many of us have houseless communities, lots of people on the street. We have people in prison. We have folks with disabilities. How are we upscaling our workforce? How are we changing the requirements to be in the workspace? Who are we willing to teach and educate so they can enter the labor force, right? There's a lot of bodies in our communities, but where are they located and what is their skill level? And who are we doing second chance employment? Are we lowering some of those barriers to access? What are the systems in play that keep people from entering into our workspaces? some other data, because again, DEI is not just feel good, but it's data driven, and it needs to be data driven so that you can move those key performance indicators. So what am I talking about? I really like the McKinsey and Company reports. If you're someone that likes to data dig, please go into that space. There's some really good DEI information there. There's corporate information. So just some numbers for your consideration. Companies with more than 30% women executives, the women at leadership, C-suite or executive directors or managers, were more likely to outperform companies where their percentage range from 10 to 30, right? Less women in leadership showcases kind of a less piece of that market share, right? Again, showcasing more of that diversity. A 2019 McKinsey report on 533 public companies found that those in the top quartile for ethnic and racial diversity in management were 36% more likely to have financial returns above the industry mean. Companies in top quartile for both gender and ethnic diversity, so that intersection, are 12% more likely to outperform companies in the same data set. Diverse teams see a 60% improvement in decision-making abilities. Research has found that a strong homogenous culture can stifle natural cognitive diversity due to the pressure to conform, right? If you're worried about your tattoos, your braids, if you're worried about things that are a part of your identity, and if someone's going to say something to you about it, or touch your hair, or question you, or mispronounce your name 5 times a day, if you have to spend time teaching and correcting when your counterparts do not, you're spending more time educating about yourself, and that's not what you were hired for, right? You are there to do the job, you are there to problem solve, but you don't get paid extra to educate. And I would say if you get a lot of folks asking you to educate them on your culture, you're bilingual, right? You're bicultural. You're teaching folks. That needs to be added to your paycheck. That's probably not going to fly, right? But if you are the diverse person in the space and you are fielding all the diversity questions, or you're the only Spanish speaker, so they send everyone to you, but you're not a translator in your job, you may consider adding that to your job description. You are asking me to be your DEI representative, but you hired me to be the admin. How can I expand my compensation for doing the DEI work for you and your organization? Because I'm growing your market share. Every time you tap me to translate, to educate, I am helping you. And we have to remember that as folks doing this work. A lot of this data is pulled from the United States and the United Kingdom, if you're wondering where those data sets are. And they also look at the world perspective, the McKinsey and Company report. So something to consider as you're pulling that data, and then where that data comes from, right? As you're kind of putting these data pieces into your slide, make sure you know where it's coming from so you can answer some of those questions and that it's relevant to what you're sharing. Some extra things, McKinsey and Company, 35% greater chance of higher financial returns than the national industry mean. Deloitte has some really good information out there too in their DEI arm. So if you're looking for some extra reports, look there. Higher cash flow per employee, 2.3 times. And then the Harvard Business Review, more sales revenue, more customers, greater profits, right? Again, not just trying to talk about it from the profit standpoint, but that's just a part of it, right? That being able to grow into other markets. Some people say, well, how do you know that bringing in X person is going to open up the work or provide more dollars? I think about the boards that I sit on, and oftentimes when I'm asked to be on the board, it's usually formed in we understand that this is what you bring to the table, but we need to diversify. We have a boardroom full of all white men. I'm in Wichita, Kansas, so it's no surprise. Like, I'm thinking about the census data. It just kind of is what it is. It's just what the numbers are. But when I come into that room, I'm bringing in the diversity, the supplier diversity. You're using this same caterer. Did you realize there are a number of other ethnic minority caterers that you could be using, right? Did you realize that probably needs to be translated? Are we serving the large Vietnamese population that we have here in Wichita? Can we get that website updated? That is the perspective I'm bringing to the space, because no one else that was sitting there thought of that, right? So what is the value add when you truly diversify? You open up a whole other market. Lots of organizations aren't even considering the largest growing language in our country, right? Spanish. You're not providing things in Spanish, or if you don't have the technology, because maybe you don't have the population, we're behind the times, and we're understanding where your resources need to go and where you need to spend to make sure that you're keeping up with the changing demographics of your community. But who is in the room to say that? when we think about the organizational impacts, right, you can have a loss of dollars when you don't lean into DEI. Well, what can that look like? Bank of America, not too long ago, a $300,000 disability discrimination housing case. They were alleged to they were alleged in refusing to issue mortgages to individuals with disabilities who were under guardianship or conservatorship. So a settlement was reached to the bank to maintain the new non-discriminatory loan underwriting policy. So they had to change a policy. They had to review how they were working in their loans. They needed to make sure that they're being in compliance with the Fair Housing Act, the Office of Federal Contracting Compliance. There are a number of things that they had to go back and look at, right? These are the things that we don't often consider when we're not paying attention to DEI. We have Johnson & Johnson was sued by an ex-exec who claimed she faced sexist, harassing, and demeaning behavior from male coworkers due to her gender and sexual orientation. Jump down, Pinterest recently paid a former executive $22.5 million to settle a gender discrimination lawsuit and is facing another from shareholders over alleged racial and gender discrimination. These are big dollars going to maybe unintentional missteps, or maybe maybe they're actual real missteps, right? Intentional, but you can pay the price. So when we think about DEI, I don't just like to talk about the spirit, but what's the law say? Do we know what the laws say in our communities? When we think about EEO, equal employment opportunity, it's important to understand that EEO, equal opportunity, diversity, and relevant laws keep evolving. Here in Wichita, I think about a year ago, they passed a non-discrimination ordinance at the Wichita municipal level. So what are your municipalities, your counties, your state legislators, what's being done in your areas, and what do you have to comply with? Because compliance is a big part of this. EEO requirements, these laws protect employees and job applicants against employment discrimination when it involves unfair treatment to these specific protected classes: race, color, religion, sex, including pregnancy, gender identity, and sexual orientation, national origin, age. Sometimes folks think, oh, I'm 21 and I've been discriminated against, and you can be, but the protected class is 40 or older. So understanding what that looks like when you're going to file a discrimination claim, disability or genetic information. So understand your municipality, your county. Where do you report discrimination on your job? Is it an easy find? Do people know when HR is doing their hiring? Are they sharing how you can report when you run into incidences? And what happens after those reports are filed? Do they just sit, right? Because people don't want to report if things aren't going to be followed through with. So just considering what that looks like, understanding and check out. You may have human rights commissions. So where do those reports go even outside of your work? If there's nothing being done in your job, can you report a discrimination claim at your city, county, or legislative level? Where do those things exist? But also being mindful that retaliation is real. I know organizations say, we don't retaliate. I've seen a lot of that too. So just what level of risk can you take? And is it worth it for you and your family to take that risk? And that is something that only you and your partners or you and your family can really understand when reporting. How did organizations respond? A lot of folks saw an upkick in DEI around the time of COVID and the George Floyd murder, and a number of things that happened after that, right? We saw some organizations say, hey, we got to take this DEI thing on. Now, there were a number of organizations that were doing that work prior to. So if your organizations were already doing that work, please make sure you honor and respect the fact that you were on that line. But a lot of folks bought in after that large incident. So when we think about the Business Roundtable, President Joshua Bolten says, this is now a core economic issue for every company in America. Every one of them is hearing from their employees and customers to address racial inequity. All the CEOs recognize that we need to do better. I would say not just racial inequity, but we're having large conversations across diversity facets now. I think most notably, we're seeing a lot more discussion around LGBTQ+. I know in our city, our state, we're seeing lots of anti-LGBTQ, lots of anti-trans bills. Lots of sports bills come across our city and our community. We tend to be a little bit more of a conservative mindset. I'm not going to get into political nature. I don't know where everyone stands. I'm not making any statements there. I'm just saying we are experiencing the anti-CRT movement. We're experiencing folks trying to run more school board members to change what's happening in our educational systems. Those things hurt your economy because we're losing in our city more women and people of color than any other population in our state. And that hurts when you're trying to be a state that wants to get your labor numbers up. You want to get more people in your community. People are looking at the policies and laws, the anti-abortion laws that are sweeping our country, not getting into belief systems. I'm just saying how those things affect your economic standing in your organizations and your communities. So how do some of our organizations respond to this kind of changing climate? You have Walmart poured in about 100 million over 5 years to create a new center on racial equity, concentrating on financial, healthcare, criminal justice, and education. You saw some owners of brands change, like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben. They retired some of those particular brands and renamed them. NFL Commissioner Roger Goodall reverses stances on players kneeling. Now, I don't know if that necessarily changed still some of the thought processes on how people feel about football players kneeling. Again, another conversation, but still very much a part of the discussion. Changes in teams and logos. In 2020, the global market for DEI, that is dollars spent by companies around the world on DEI related efforts. So maybe that's employee resource groups, maybe that's training, putting people in places, so your diversity officers. The estimated amount spent was about 7.5 million. And it's projected to more than double to 15.4 billion by 2026. So we see companies and organizations are pouring dollars into DEI, but we can't necessarily say we're seeing the needle move. Dollars are being spent, but where are those dollars being spent, and what is the accountability with those dollars, right? Just because you put together a diversity council does not mean you're moving the needle in diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization. That means you have a council. So what is that council doing? When you bring in a diversity officer or a chief diversity officer, what are they tasked with doing with? What are they supposed to be doing, right? How many of those dollars are going back out into your community? So we're going to move into social identities, going into how you all identify. And in those social identities, where does that come from? Well, there's a theory from Henry Tefel who states it's a person's sense of who they are based on their group memberships. And just being reflective, think about some of the groups that you're a part of or group memberships that you're in. And maybe that's actually truly paid memberships. Maybe you're in SHRM. Or when you think about your identities, how do you identify and where do you connect with folks in that space? Tefel proposed that these groups may encompass things like social class, family, your football team. So if there's any Chiefs fans, I'm most close to the Kansas City Chiefs. We don't have to go into that argument, but that's my team of choice. So that would be my tribe, if you will. Where folks belong, their pride and place, their self-esteem, kind of that sense of this is where I am in the social world. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being a part of these groups. It becomes problematic when we divide the world into the us and them, like you're not invited here. We won't advance you because, right? Some of those things are something that we need to be mindful of when we create the groups. Now, I certainly understand the need though for, and I've said ERG a couple of times, or BRG, employee resource groups, business resource groups. Those are maybe your pride groups that are your LGBTQ plus and ally folks on the job that come together and meet, and they have a budget and there are things that they're focusing on. They're doing training, they're educating. Your Hispanic Latinx groups, your veterans in the workspace groups, right? What are those common themes that bring this group of people together to create this home away from home sense? Those things are necessary, especially when the numbers might be skewed very low for your global minority folks. If you only have 5 veterans in a space, they may be looking for each other. And so having that veterans employee resource group would be helpful for them to bounce ideas off of each other, create that support, connecting them maybe to your other veteran services in your city or your state. Those are the purposes of having these particular groups. So social identities are important, but we don't want to be discriminatory, right? We wouldn't then say, don't hire those veterans because we know they all have PTSD. That would be problematic, right? You're being discriminatory, you're being microaggressive, you're creating spaces for folks to not thrive when you other that group of people. And understanding that we can all have multiple and intersectional identities. So when we think about the iceberg, and we can use the iceberg analogy for pretty much everything, but there are all these things that you can see at the waterline in identities, right? And that could be, I can see maybe your visible disabilities. I can see the color of your skin. I can see your hair texture. There's things I can see, but there are a number of things that I can observe, but I can't make overlaying statements about who's walking up to me because of all the things that might be under that waterline, right? Systems, values, life experiences, beliefs, work style, perspectives, talents, languages. There are all these things that kind of cliche thing, you can't judge a book by its cover, right? And we say these things, but yet we still do that snap judgment, all right? And that snap judgment can be problematic, particularly when you are hiring, picking folks for your board, doling out resources, doling out grant dollars, right? Understanding those systemic barriers that keep people from being able to engage. So we're going to go into our final breakout group for you all to just kind of share some of your identities. And when we think about this wheel, there are a number of things featured here. Maybe there's something that you identify with that is not featured. I would really encourage you to share, right? Maybe it's your first language, your physical, emotional, or developmental abilities or disabilities, your religion or spiritual affiliation. But whatever that is, whatever lens you want to look through, you're going to answer the questions, which social identities are most central to how you see yourself as a person and why? What social identities have the biggest impact on how others treat you and why? And does your answer change depending on context? Obviously, you can't answer every one of those questions. So pick one question and share and engage in your groups. This one's going to be about 6 minutes, so not long, but please make sure you engage. We're not going to be able to share out on this particular one, so please make sure you're engaging your groups. The question is in the chat. I'll make sure I share it in the chat, but be thinking about what those identities are, answer one of those questions, and just kind of engage with those in the room around this wheel. And you'll be going to your breakout. All right. Welcome back, folks. Due to time, I'm going to hit the ground running. I hope you all had great discussions. I will also add, please join us for some of our other sessions where I'm going to go more in depth on these particular topics. We do not get to share out, but please continue the conversations in your chats. And I hope that you all are also still connecting. We have a larger social identities coming up, and I know we should be done for you all at 11:15. I'm going to ask for about 10 more minutes of your time as we move forward. Microaggressions, many of us have experienced microaggressions or have shared them. Just as a definition, these are unintended discriminations towards socially marginalized groups, but anyone can experience or say a microaggression, right? These are things that are more covertly implied, and they are generally statements that repeat or affirm stereotypes. So just understanding how those things affect people on the job, right? I kind of shared this a little earlier. If you're worried about how you look, how you might not fit in, or you might not be the homogenous person in the space, right? You might be the person that sticks out as a sore thumb. How are we handling these microaggressions? And those, some examples of that may be men mistaking another man for the company CEO when the female CEO is right next to them. And that's happened to me, where they're like, oh, you're the executive director? Yes, I am. Right? So how are we being mindful? How are we mitigating our bias and the microaggressions that we're using? And ultimately, how are we addressing them? Oftentimes these things go unaddressed because we are grappling with what was said and the intention of what is said. It's important for us to ask the question, can you tell me more about what you just said? Or can you clarify what I think I heard you say was that my English was good, but maybe you were expecting it not to sound good. Tell me more about where that's coming from, right? Sometimes just opening the dialogue when you're ready, right? Because oftentimes we're not the person to teach, but sometimes it's important for us to engage. Privilege and oppression. Again, this is going to be another series piece, microaggressions and privilege and oppression. Privilege is when you think something is not a problem because it's not a problem to you personally. Some common language for us. Privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. And the oppression is a state of being subject to unjust treatment or control. I definitely believe that we all can experience privilege and oppression. I do believe there are some groups, particularly your historical minorities in the community in the United States. In that perspective, I can't speak for other countries, do experience oppression at higher rates in comparison to their counterparts. And that might be when people hear they belong to a privileged group or benefit from something like race or gender privilege, they don't get it or they feel angry. Defensiveness comes up a lot in privilege and oppression, right? Just because you have privilege does not mean that you didn't work hard or that you didn't have to get it out of the mud, right? We're not saying that. We are saying, though, who you know and who knows you can get you a long way. I am saying if you have a familial home, right, home ownership also creates equity, also creates opportunities when you can borrow against your equity, right? Not everyone had that opportunity because they were redlined out of that opportunity or they were kept from getting a loan, right? And if your family, if your great, 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 great grandpa was a veteran and got that GI Bill, those dollars probably still benefit your family to this day, right? Someone paid for your college, whatever that looks like. That is a privilege, which is a benefit of giving you a leg up. Not a bad thing, but something that's real. Action steps. I want to hop into this because these are some important things, and hopefully you picked up some skills and things to utilize in your work today throughout. But here are some things that are a little bit more action oriented. Counteract and know your culture. Take the time to deconstruct and relearn. There's a lot of relearning we have to do, right? If you went to public schools, whatever your schooling is, there were particular books that were picked, right? There's a particular history you were taught. How much of that do you have to go back and relearn from the vantage point of the person most affected by the history? So what do we have to deconstruct? What are the policies and procedures in your organization? What are the things that need to be reviewed, relooked at? What do folks actually need to have to work in your space? What's necessary? Do they have to have a PhD? And some spaces are that, right? I want my doctor doing my surgery to be the most educated person they need to be, right? I need them to have that level of education. Some things, though, don't need that level of education. So is it just it's just a certificate? Or are you willing to spend the dollars to educate the person that's really hungry and passionate on the job to do that job? Do we have to send someone to school? What are those things that we're willing to do? Audit your print and marketing and your website material. Are you creating and providing things in different languages? Can you? What technology needs to be purchased to be able to meet your different clients at their need level? Who needs to be hired? What needs to be outsourced, right? There's all types of amazing companies that you can work alongside. Be aware of the cultural norms in your organization, the communities that you're working with. You can't just go into the community and try to change it. You got to build trust with communities, right? You can't just say, I need to diversify my board, so I'm going to reach out to the Hispanic professionals group, and you've never reached out to them before. What work are you doing in those communities to build rapport and trust so that you can tap these communities to be a part of your organization? But if you've not done any work or built any trust, how can you go into a community and say, we're going to do this for you? And some of that is the town hall meeting. Some of that is you got to listen to the griping. And a lot of us just want to get to the work. But I would allot about 30 minutes for community to share what they've been through. So then you can get to the solution, right? Allow folks to tell their stories. Learn the language. Is it pronoun? Is it people first language? What are the things you need to know to engage with the communities that you're working with, your colleagues? What are those things, right? You can't keep mispronouncing someone's name. How do you work on it off the clock? A lot of folks like to approach DEI from the golden rule. If you just be respectful, if you're just nice to everyone, like, or my religion calls me just to be nice, and that's fine. I think that's a basis. Respect and being nice is a great basis, but you're not going to learn how to pronounce that person's name correctly if you don't work on it, right? So it's training and coaching yourself to do the work, not just being nice, that's a start. Not just being respectful, that's a start. But how are you getting in community? How are you educating yourself? How many other trainings or opportunities? How many other cultures are you visiting throughout your year to create relationships and proximity with people? Some other pieces for you to consider. These are the diversity, equity, and inclusion, the Lighthouse 2023 report. This also comes from McKinsey and Company. They identified 5 success factors that are common across DEI initiatives, and some of the significant things that organizations need to understand to move the needle. So they're not just talking about it or checking the box, but do you understand the nuanced understanding of the root causes in your organization, right? Understand what the problem is with the deep fact-based look. What is a root cause? If you can't diversify your organization, why? Why is it? Have we talked to the folks in the organization that are our global majorities? Are they comfortable there? When was the last time we moved someone up or promoted someone from within the organization? Are you getting input from the target population initially and throughout the changes in your processes? And what are you prioritizing? 2, meaningful definitions of success. Set clear and quantifiable aspirations. I want to be reflective of the city by 2025. And this is what it looks like. I've looked at the census data. I looked at the populations in my community. This is where we need to be. I looked at the school systems. We see that there's over 129 languages being spoken in that school system. How many of those kids are going to stay here and get jobs? How many of them are going to go to college here? These are data points that you can look at to really articulate where you want to go and where you want to move. I want a diversity, equity, and inclusion council. This is what we need to move that forward, right? Are there CEOs, is there buy-in from your top down, right? Accountable and invested business leaders, right? You can start things at the entry level, but is that where the most buy-in is going to be? Because you can start something, and if your CEO, your executive director, your board is going to shut it down, then you're doing just more of that feel-good work, and that's fine. But if you want to move the needle, you do need that upper buy-in. What's the budget for DEI? Do we just talk about it, or can you see where the money is spent in the budget line, and is it meaningful dollars? Those solutions, and then just defining your key performance indicators. What are your dashboards? Where can you find where we're moving the work? Lastly, cultural humility. I just totally believe in being able to buy into this, a process that requires humility. Each has something of great value to learn from one another. As individuals, continually engaging in self-reflection, self-critique, and lifelong learning. This is a lifelong learning thing, right? How do we continue to ask the appropriate questions? How do we look at the power imbalances in our organization? How are we being humble and getting educated in this work, right? We don't know everything. So how do we grow and reflect? I want to leave you all with a personal impact statement. So what will you do, or how will this session inform your work moving forward? What are you committed to doing to impact change with what you've learned? And what must you do to succeed in that commitment? So who's going to help you? Who's going to hold you accountable to your goals? The next couple of slides are just some resources. You all will get a modified version of these slides so you can continue to look at some of the different resources that exist. I want to stop now because I think there may be some questions because I had to run through really, really quickly. And also I can stay after. I know Best Start might need to stop, but I'm here to answer any questions you all have too. So I'm going to stop. Questions, anything, statement, disagreement? No? Well, Stephanie or Darrell, I'll turn this back over to you and then just kind of stay back if folks have some questions.
Sounds good, and I'll share my screen. All right.
Who?
Oh. I thought it was a question, but I guess. Again, you guys, here's the QR code if you guys did need it. If you aren't able to use the sign-in link that is in the chat, I know that David also put it in the chat, so just in case you missed it, here's the QR code, and then on the chat is the link. We'll see you guys on our next session, session 3, which the topic is emotional intelligence. That will be Wednesday, October 4th. So that will be our next session. And then lastly, thank you all for joining us today. And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.